My husband told me for 20 years that we were in debt. But one day I found a check for $5 million in his name. I said nothing. I simply waited for him to fall asleep. What I did next changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that the happiest years of your life are the ones you don't notice passing. I believe that now. Back then, I simply lived them, or thought I did. My name is Dorothy Harper. I'm 71 years old and I live in a small house in Millbrook, Ohio, the kind of town where everybody waves from their porch and nobody asks too many questions. For 40 years, I planted marigolds along the front walk every spring. I made pot roast on Sundays. I raised 2 daughters, Karen and Beth, and I loved a man named Ronald Harper, with a steadiness I mistook for wisdom. Ron was a careful man. That was the word I used for decades. Careful. Careful with the thermostat, careful with the grocery list, careful with every dollar that came through our door. We had been married 20 years when he first sat me down at the kitchen table, spread out a sheet of yellow legal paper covered in his small, tight handwriting, and told me we were in debt. Not catastrophically, he said, just enough that we needed to be smart. He used that word often, smart, as in, it wouldn't be smart to redecorate the living room. As in, it wouldn't be smart to fly out to Karen's baby shower. As in, it wouldn't be smart for me to go back to work at my age because the taxes would eat whatever I earned. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He handled the finances. He always had. I ran the house. He ran the money. And that arrangement had felt natural for so long that questioning it seemed almost rude. Like asking a surgeon to explain each stitch while he was still sewing. So I clipped coupons. I bought the store brand cereal. I told Beth we couldn't come to her gallery opening in Chicago because the flights were too expensive, and I watched her face go flat over the phone, and I felt the particular shame of a woman who cannot explain her own poverty because she doesn't fully understand it herself. The first signal I didn't recognize as a signal came about 3 years ago. Ron started driving a different route home from his Thursday golf game. I only knew because our neighbor Paulette mentioned she hadn't seen his car on Elm Street lately, and something small and cold moved through me, quick as a fish, before I pushed it down. He'd changed routes. So what? People change routes. The second signal came that winter. I found a receipt in his coat pocket. I was taking it to the dry cleaner for dinner at Marcello's, which is the Italian place on 5th that charges $40 for a pasta dish. The receipt was for 2. Ron had told me he'd worked late that Thursday. I stood in the hallway holding that piece of paper for a long moment before I put it back. He'd treated a client, I told myself. That's what men like Ron do. The third signal I cannot excuse myself for ignoring. Last April, his phone buzzed on the nightstand while he was in the shower, and the name that lit up the screen was simply C. 1 letter. I saw it. I looked away. I went downstairs and started breakfast and told myself that a single initial meant nothing. But something had shifted inside me by then. Something quiet and geological, the way the ground shifts before anyone feels the earthquake. I started paying attention in a different way, not aggressively, just attentively. I noticed that Ron always collected the mail before I could get to it. I noticed that he'd started password protecting his laptop, which he never used to do. I noticed that once a month he drove into Columbus alone, saying he had a meeting with the financial advisor, and came back in a better mood than he'd been in all week. And then came the night that changed everything. It was a Wednesday in late October. Ron had fallen asleep in the armchair watching the news, the way he always did, chin dropping to his chest within 10 minutes of sitting down. I was passing through the living room when I saw his jacket thrown over the back of the couch. Not hung up, which was unlike him. Something made me stop. I don't know what exactly. Call it instinct. Call it 20 years of accumulated unease finally reaching a boiling point. I slipped my hand into the inside breast pocket. My fingers closed around a folded piece of paper. I walked to the kitchen. I unfolded it under the overhead light. It was a cashier's check, made out to Ronald James Harper, in the amount of $5,200,000, issued from a private investment firm in Columbus called Meridian Capital Group, dated 3 weeks earlier. I stood there in my kitchen in my slippers and my old cardigan, and I read that number 4 times, $5,200,000, from a company I had never heard of, deposited, or meant to be deposited, into an account whose number I did not recognize. We were in debt, he had told me. For 20 years, we were in debt. I looked at my husband sleeping in the next room. I listened to the sound of the television, some anchor reading tomorrow's weather. I folded the check very carefully, put it back exactly as I had found it, and returned the jacket to the couch. Then I went upstairs, got into bed, and lay in the dark with my eyes open. I did not cry. I was past crying. What I felt was something colder and much more useful. I lay awake until 4 a.m. that night, and I did something I had not done in years. I made a list in my head, not a grocery list, not a list of things to fix around the house, a list of everything I had given up. Karen's baby shower. I hadn't been there when my first grandchild came into the world because we couldn't afford the flight. My granddaughter Lily was 3 now. She called Ron Grandpa Ron with total adoration, and he bought her stuffed animals and took her for ice cream, because somehow there was always money for that. Beth's gallery opening. I had missed it, and Beth had never entirely forgiven me, not because she was unkind, but because she couldn't understand and I couldn't explain. My own dental work 2 years ago, I had put off a crown because Ron said the timing was bad, and I'd spent 6 months in low-grade pain rather than spend the money. My sister Evelyn's 70th birthday trip to Savannah, which 6 of us had been planning for a year, I had canceled 3 weeks before, citing finances, and Evelyn had been gracious about it in a way that was somehow worse than anger. I lay in the dark, and I counted. 20 years of counted pennies. 20 years of, we can't afford it, and maybe next year, and you know how tight things are. 20 years of feeling vaguely ashamed of our circumstances without ever quite understanding them, because I had trusted the man in the next room to tell me the truth about our own life. $5,200,000. The fear came, of course. It came the way fear always does, not all at once, but in waves, each one a little higher than the last. What if I was wrong? What if there was an explanation? What if I confronted him and he had some reasonable answer and I had simply embarrassed myself and damaged our marriage over a misunderstanding? But I had folded that check. I had read that account number. And I knew, the way you know things you have spent years refusing to know, that there was no reasonable explanation. A man does not hide $5 million from his wife because of an oversight. He hides it because he intends to keep it. The question was, keep it for what? And for whom? I thought about the single initial on his phone. C. I thought about Marcello's. I thought about the Columbus trips once a month, the better moods, the password on the laptop, and I understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its completeness that I was not only dealing with hidden money, I was dealing with a hidden life. By the time the sky outside the window began to go gray, I had made my decision. I was not going to confront Ron, not yet. Not directly, not emotionally, not over the kitchen table with my voice shaking and him ready with his explanations. That was what he would expect. That was what a woman like me was supposed to do. Cry and ask and beg for the truth. I was not going to give him that advantage. I was going to be smart. His word, smart. Here is what I decided that morning, lying very still beside a man I had been married to for 40 years. First, I needed a copy of that check. Second, I needed to understand where that money had come from and where it was going. Third, I needed a lawyer, not a general family friend, not someone Ron knew, but a divorce attorney, a sharp one, before Ron had any idea I was looking for one. And fourth, I needed to do all of this without changing a single thing about my daily behavior. Same pot roast on Sundays, same marigolds, same Dorothy. The plan felt enormous and terrifying in the gray dawn light. I was 70 years old. I had not managed my own finances in 4 decades. I did not know what a forensic accountant was, though I would soon learn. I did not know that Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which would matter enormously in the months to come. But I knew how to be patient. I had been patient for 20 years. I got up at 6, as I always did. I started the coffee. When Ron came downstairs at 7, I smiled and handed him his mug and asked whether he wanted eggs. He said yes, scrambled, same as always. I made them, and while I stood at that stove with my back to him, I was already planning. The first thing I needed was access to a copy machine without Ron knowing. Our church had one in the office. I volunteered there on Tuesday mornings, had for 15 years, 3 days away. I would have to wait, and waiting would be the hardest part. But I had learned something useful in 70 years of living. The women who win are rarely the ones who move fastest. They are the ones who move right. I set his plate in front of him. He was reading the sports section. He didn't look up. "Thank you, Dot," he said. "Of course," I said. I sat across from him and drank my coffee and looked at his face, a face I knew better than any face in the world. And I thought, you have no idea what is coming. Tuesday morning arrived with the particular slowness of days you are waiting for. I dressed carefully, not differently, nothing that would register as unusual. My blue cardigan, my practical shoes, the small pearl earrings Ron had given me on our 20th anniversary, which I now wore with a complex feeling I couldn't quite name. I told him I was going to the church to help with the food pantry inventory, same as every week. He nodded from behind his coffee without looking up. He was already somewhere else in his mind. He often was, I realize now, recalibrating that fact. At the church, I asked Paulette, who runs the office and has the discretion of a stone wall, if I could use the copier for something personal. She said, of course, and stepped out to check in the coffee urns. I had brought the jacket with me in a dry cleaning bag exactly as planned. My hands trembled slightly as I retrieved the check from the breast pocket. I placed it face down on the glass, pressed the green button, and watched the light slide underneath it. 2 copies. I folded one and placed it in the inside zipper pocket of my purse, a pocket I had never used in 20 years of carrying that bag. I returned the original to the jacket. Then I sat in the church parking lot for a few minutes and breathed. The next step required a phone call I could not make from home. I had written the name down on a slip of paper the night before, after searching on my tablet with the privacy mode turned on. Margaret Osei, family law attorney, Columbus. She had 17 years of experience and a review that said, simply, "She doesn't miss anything." That was what I needed. Someone who didn't miss anything. I called from my cell phone, parked 2 streets from home in front of the public library. The receptionist was efficient and kind and set me an appointment for Thursday afternoon. I said I would be there. I said my name was Dorothy. I said it was a consultation about a potential divorce. The word sat in my mouth like something foreign. Divorce. I was 70 years old. We had been married 40 years. The word felt both enormous and, strangely, like the first honest word I had spoken in months. Thursday, I told Ron I was meeting my friend Harriet for lunch in Columbus and might do a little shopping after. He barely registered this. He had his own Thursday plans, which I now understood completely. Margaret Osei's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, clean and spare and serious. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the manner of someone who has heard every possible version of every possible story and remains unshockable. I liked her immediately. I placed the copy of the check on her desk. She studied it for a long moment. Then she looked at me over her glasses. "How long have you been aware of this account?" she asked. 10 days, I said. I found the original check in his jacket. I don't know the full history of the account. Do you have access to any of your joint financial documents? Tax returns? Bank statements? He manages all of that, but our tax returns are filed jointly. I've signed them for 40 years. She nodded slowly. We can subpoena records. If this money came from an investment account that was established during the marriage, regardless of whose name is on it, Ohio law considers it a marital asset. She paused. "Mrs. Harper, I want to ask you something directly. Are you certain you want to pursue this?" "Yes," I said. No tremor in my voice. I surprised myself. She gave me a list of things to begin documenting quietly. Any financial statements I could photograph, account numbers I came across, unusual expenses. She also recommended a forensic accountant named David Park, who specialized in hidden asset cases. She said she would file nothing yet. We would gather first. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Agency. The sensation of moving through my own life rather than being moved through it. But something had shifted at home in my absence. When I came through the door, Ron was in the kitchen. He had made himself a sandwich, which was unusual. He almost never made his own food when I was available to do it. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. "How was Harriet?" he asked. "Fine," I said, hanging up my coat. "We had soup at that French place on Broad." "She called here," he said, "about 20 minutes ago, on the house phone." The air went very still. "She was trying to reach you," he continued, watching me. "Said your cell went to voicemail." I had forgotten to charge it in the car on the way back. It had died somewhere on I-70. She probably wanted to chat more, I said evenly. "You know how Harriet is. I'll call her back." Ron said nothing for a moment. He bit into his sandwich. Then, "You seem tired." "Long drive," I said, and I went upstairs to change my clothes, my heart beating in a way I could feel behind my eyes. He didn't push further. but I knew something had registered. Ron was a careful man. He would begin watching more carefully now. That evening, while he was in the garage, I went to his desk, something I never did. The middle drawer was unlocked. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was looking for anything real. Tucked beneath a car insurance renewal was a personal bank statement. Not from our joint account, from something called a Premier Private Account at a bank in Columbus. The most recent balance listed was $4,800,000. My hand didn't shake this time. I photographed every page with my phone, texted them to an email address I had created that week under a name Ron didn't know, then deleted the texts and cleared the sent folder in my email app. Then I put the statement back exactly as I had found it, went to the kitchen, and started dinner. I had my proof. I sent the bank statement photographs to Margaret Osei the following morning, and within the week she had matched them with records subpoenaed from Meridian Capital Group. The picture that emerged was detailed and damning. Ron had been quietly accumulating a separate investment portfolio for 11 years. The money had started as modest transfers, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, the kind of sums that disappear easily in the noise of household finances. But Meridian had done its work, and what had begun as careful skimming had compounded into something that now, according to David Park's initial analysis, totaled just over $6 million across 3 linked accounts. $6 million! While I had been clipping coupons and missing my granddaughter's birth, Margaret filed for divorce on a Monday morning in November. By Ohio law, Ron was served at home by a process server that afternoon. I was not there when it happened. I was sitting in Paulette's kitchen 2 miles away drinking tea and watching the clock. My phone buzzed at 3:47 p.m. It was Ron. I let it ring, then again and again, then a text. "Dorothy, call me now." I finished my tea. I thanked Paulette, who asked no questions, and squeezed my hand at the door. I drove home. Ron was standing in the living room when I came in. He had the divorce papers in his hand, and he looked, I searched for the right word later, caught. Not angry first, caught first. The anger came a few seconds behind, like thunder after lightning. "What is this?" he said, though he knew perfectly well what it was. "You've been served," I said. "Margaret Osei is my attorney. All communication should go through her from now on." He stared at me. 40 years, Dorothy." "Yes," I said. 40 years. You can't seriously think—" He stopped. Reset. I could see him recalibrating, the way he did when he was about to shift tactics. His voice dropped to something quieter and more dangerous. "Where did you get the idea that I was hiding anything? Someone's been filling your head with nonsense. Is it Karen? Is it Beth? Because I promise you, there are explanations for everything you think you've found. Then you can give those explanations to the court," I said. I went upstairs. I locked the bedroom door, which I had never done in 40 years of marriage. The next 3 days were difficult. Ron did not rage. He was too strategic for that. Instead, he deployed a campaign of quiet pressure, long sighs, wounded silences, pointed comments about what a divorce would do to this family. He called Karen, who called me crying, saying Dad sounded devastated, and was I sure about this? He called Beth, who was more measured but still worried. He was constructing the narrative that I was the one doing damage, that I was breaking something precious out of paranoia or midlife crisis or whatever story he could make stick. And then Cindy appeared. I had not yet learned her full name. I would soon. On the 4th day after he was served, Ron left the house in the afternoon and came back at 7 with a woman I had never met. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the careful grooming of someone who has worked hard to look effortless. She sat down in my living room as though she had been there before. Perhaps she had been, on the Thursdays when I was at church. "Dorothy," Ron said with a maddening composure, "this is Cindy Marsh. She's my financial partner. She has information about the accounts that I think will clarify everything, if you'll just listen." Cindy Marsh. See, there it was. She leaned forward and began speaking in a smooth, practiced way about investment structures and tax shelters and how the accounts had been set up to protect both of us, how nothing had been hidden with ill intent, how she and Ron had simply been building a financial future that required a certain kind of privacy during the structuring phase. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "You're his girlfriend." Silence. "I'm not going to listen to an explanation from the woman my husband has been with on Thursday evenings for the past several years. If your name appears on any of the accounts in question, my attorney will be in touch with you directly." I stood up. "I'd like you both to leave now." Ron's composure cracked. He told me I was making an enormous mistake. He told me I didn't understand what I was throwing away. His voice rose in a way I hadn't heard in years, and Cindy put her hand on his arm, and somehow that gesture, that proprietary, practiced gesture, told me everything I needed to know about the duration and nature of their arrangement. I opened the front door. "Good night," I said. They left. I closed the door, leaned against it, and pressed my hands flat against the wood and breathed. My legs were shaking slightly. My heart was loud in my ears, but I had held. I had not cried, not pleaded, not given an inch. After a moment, I picked up my phone and called Margaret to report the visit. She said I had handled it correctly and to document the time and what had been said. Then I called Karen. "I need a few days," I told her. "I need to come stay with you, just for a long weekend. I need to breathe." She said yes without hesitation. I drove to Columbus on Friday morning, and for 4 days I sat in my daughter's backyard with my granddaughter Lily climbing into my lap and showing me drawings of cats, and I let myself be somewhere quiet and warm. I did not think about Ron. I did not think about the accounts. I pressed my face into Lily's hair and smelled the clean child smell of her, and let that be enough. I came home rested and harder in a way that felt necessary. The offer came by letter through Ron's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, whose firm was polished and expensive and clearly accustomed to making problems disappear quietly. The letter used careful legal language, but the substance was simple. Ron was prepared to settle outside of court. He would offer me the house outright, plus a lump sum of $350,000, plus monthly spousal support of $4,000 for 10 years. I read the letter at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Then I set it down and looked out the window at my marigold beds, brown now with November, and I did a very simple calculation. $350,000 plus 10 years of spousal support came to roughly $830,000 total. He was offering me $800,000 to go away quietly and leave him with $6 million. I took the letter to Margaret. She read it and said with characteristic understatement, "He's hoping you don't understand what you're entitled to." Under Ohio's equitable distribution law, marital assets accumulated during the marriage, regardless of whose name they were in, were subject to division. David Park had now completed his initial forensic report. The total hidden assets came to $6,100,000. Additionally, the debt Ron had cited for 20 years was, in large part, fabricated. A fiction built from a combination of exaggerated mortgage figures and an investment account that had never actually been losing money. I had not been living in poverty. I had been living in a performance of poverty while my husband built a fortune he intended to share with someone else. Reject it, I told Margaret. She drafted the rejection letter that afternoon. Ron's response 3 days later was personal rather than legal. He came to the house. He was still legally entitled to be there until the court order otherwise, a fact I was actively working to change, and sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded in the careful way he had, and said he wanted to talk. I sat across from him. I waited. He told me he had made mistakes. He told me that Cindy meant nothing. She was a business relationship that had become complicated. He told me that everything he had built had been for us, for our future, for security in our old age, and that he had planned to tell me once the accounts were fully structured. He told me he missed me. He looked at me with the eyes of a man I had loved for 40 years, and he said, "Dot, we're old. Do we really want to spend whatever time we have left on this?" It was well done. I'll give him that. A younger version of me, the version who had believed him about the debt, who had canceled Beth's gallery opening, who had missed Lily's birth. That version might have wavered. I poured myself more coffee. "Ronald," I said, "you hid $6 million from me for 11 years. You built a secret life with another woman. You let me live in false poverty while you invested our marital money under your name alone. And now you want me to call it a mistake." I paused. "I don't believe you plan to tell me anything. I believe you plan to leave. I think the accounts were preparation." He said nothing. "Cindy is 51, I said. I had looked her up. "You're 68. I think the timeline on what you were building isn't very hard to work out." He left without another word. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Evelyn. My sister had known me for 71 years, through our parents' deaths and my wedding and the births of my children and everything that had come between. I told her everything: the check, the accounts, the attorney, Cindy Marsh, the settlement offer, all of it. I talked for 2 hours while she listened, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy," she said, "I thought something was wrong 5 years ago. You remember when you canceled Savannah? You didn't sound right. You sounded like a woman who was apologizing for existing." I had to put the phone down for a moment. We made a plan. Evelyn would come to Millbrook for the month. She had a guest room to spare in her schedule, and she said she wasn't about to let me go through the rest of this alone. She arrived on a Wednesday with 2 suitcases and a bottle of good bourbon and the no-nonsense practicality of a woman who had outlasted her own difficulties. I also, during those weeks, found something I hadn't expected: a divorce support group for women over 60 that met at the community center on Thursday evenings. The first time I went, I sat in the circle and listened to other women's stories and felt for the first time in months that I was not uniquely foolish. A retired teacher named Gloria had been through something strikingly similar. A husband, a secret account, a younger woman, years of managed financial deception. She was 2 years out from her divorce, and she was fine. More than fine. The hardest part, she told me afterward over bad coffee, is remembering that his lies don't make you stupid. They make him a liar. Those are different things. I thought about that for a long time. They came together on a Saturday afternoon in early December, which told me the visit had been planned and rehearsed. Evelyn was at the grocery store. I was alone in the house when Ron's car pulled into the drive. I watched from the kitchen window as both of them got out. Ron in his good coat, Cindy in something quietly expensive. And I took a moment to recognize what I was feeling. Not fear, not yet. Something more like the sensation before a storm, when the air pressure changes and the birds go quiet. I opened the door before they knocked. "I'd rather you called ahead," I said. "Dorothy." Ron's voice was warm, which was worse than when it was cold. "Please, we just want to talk. No lawyers, no letters, just people." I let them in because it was cold, and because I wanted to hear exactly what they had come to say. They sat on the sofa, close together but not quite touching, maintaining, I noticed, a careful performance of distance. Ron did most of the talking at first. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he'd spoken to a counselor. He said he could see how his behavior had caused hurt, real hurt, and that he took responsibility for that. He used the phrase, "take responsibility" 3 times in 4 minutes. I counted. Then Cindy spoke. She had changed her approach entirely from the last visit. Gone was the smooth financial explanation. She was softer now, almost humble, her hands folded in her lap like a woman in a waiting room. She said she wanted me to know that she had encouraged Ron to be honest with me from the beginning. She said she wasn't the villain in my story. She said she understood that I was angry and that I had every right to be, but that dragging this through the courts would hurt everyone. Our daughters, our granddaughter, me, Ron, and that there was still a version of this that could end with everyone intact. "Lily doesn't need to grow up knowing her grandparents went to war," she said. There it was. I looked at her for a moment. She held my gaze with the practiced openness of someone who had prepared for this exact reaction. She had thought carefully about what would reach me. She had chosen my granddaughter. "Lily," I said, "is 3 years old and currently believes that caterpillars are just very shy butterflies. She isn't going to be damaged by her grandparents' legal proceedings. She's going to be fine." I paused. "What you're describing, what you're both describing, isn't a conversation. It's a negotiation strategy, dressed as an apology. I've been married to a careful man for 40 years. I know the difference." Ron's warmth dropped away like a coat falling from a hook. "You are going to regret this," he said. And now there was something under the words that I hadn't heard before. Something flat and cold and final. "You don't have any idea how these things work. Gerald can make this extremely unpleasant. We can tie this up in court for 2 years. You'll spend everything you're fighting for on legal fees. And at the end of it, you'll be 73 years old, and you'll have a settlement that doesn't look so different from what we offered you in October." Cindy put her hand on his arm again. The same gesture as before. A reflex. "Ron," she said quietly, "a warning." But he was beyond warnings now. "I built that money," he said. "Every cent. You stayed home and kept the house, and that was worth something. I'm not saying it wasn't. But you didn't build what I built. You want to take half of something you didn't create." I stood up. "Ohio law disagrees with your characterization," I said. "So does David Park's forensic report, which has now been submitted to the court. I suggest you speak with Gerald about the implications of that document." I walked to the front door and opened it. "Please don't come to this house again without scheduling it through my attorney." Cindy stood first. She touched Ron's shoulder, a signal, and he stood, and they walked out. At the threshold, Ron turned once more. "Don't do this, Dot." "Good night, Ron," I said. I closed the door. Then I walked to the kitchen and gripped the counter with both hands and stood there until my breathing slowed. My hands were shaking, not with weakness, with a particular trembling that comes after you have held very still for a very long time. He had threatened me, openly, and that threat should have frightened me. And it did, a cold flash of it. The reality of how ugly this could get, how long it could take, how much it could cost. But here is what I learned that day. Fear and resolve are not opposites. They can live in the same body at the same time. The fear was real, and it made every reason I had for continuing feel sharper and more certain. I picked up my phone and called Margaret. "They came to the house," I said. "Ron made statements that may be relevant to the case. She asked me to write down everything, word for word, as accurately as I could remember. I did. I sent her 4 pages. When Evelyn came home with the groceries, I told her, she listened without interrupting, then she poured us each 2 fingers of bourbon and said, 'Good. Let them show exactly who they are. That's always useful.' I raised my glass to that. The preliminary hearing was set for the 2nd week of January. I had never been inside a courtroom before as a participant. I had expected it to feel enormous and frightening. It was a mid-sized room with fluorescent lighting and the faint smell of old paper. A place where truths were finally required to sit still and be examined. I wore my navy dress and the small pearl earrings. Karen sat behind me in the gallery, and Beth had driven up from Cincinnati and sat beside her, and knowing they were there, just behind my left shoulder, was something I carried into the room like a hand at my back. Margaret Osei stood beside me at the plaintiff's table with the stillness of someone who had no doubt about the quality of her preparation. Ron sat at the opposite table in a dark suit that had cost more than my car. He did not look at me when I came in. He was performing the composure of an innocent man, the way he had been performing things for years. Cindy Marsh sat just behind him. Her name had appeared in David Park's forensic report as a co-signatory on one of the investment accounts. Margaret presented David Park's forensic report first. He testified for 40 minutes, walking the court through the 11-year history of the accounts. The initial transfers, the compounding returns, the use of Meridian Capital Group as an intermediary to obscure the money's marital origins. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses, wrote steadily on a small notepad. Then Gerald Fitch offered Ron's counter-narrative. The money, Ron claimed, had been seeded by an inheritance from his uncle Fred Harper, who had died 14 years ago, which under Ohio law would potentially qualify as separate property rather than marital assets. It was a prepared argument. It almost might have worked. Almost. Margaret asked Gerald to confirm the date of Fred Harper's death and the inheritance distribution. Gerald confirmed. Fred Harper had died 14 years ago. Estate distributed 12 and a half years ago. Then Margaret produced a certified record from Meridian Capital Group, showing the date of the first transfer into Ron's private account. It was dated 9 years ago, nearly 4 years after the inheritance had been distributed. The silence in the room had a texture to it. Gerald recovered quickly and argued that Ron had held the inherited funds in a personal account for several years before investing. Margaret then produced those subpoenaed account records. The inherited funds had been deposited, drawn down to zero within 14 months, and spent entirely. The balance at the end of that period was $41. The seed money for the private investment portfolio could not have come from Fred Harper. Ron turned to Gerald and said something low and urgent. Gerald put his hand on Ron's arm, a gesture I had seen Cindy use, and it struck me with some dark comedy that Ron was surrounded by people physically restraining him from his own impulses. Cindy had gone very still. Margaret asked pleasantly whether Mr. Fitch would like to offer an amended explanation for the source of the initial investment capital. Gerald asked for a brief recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. During that recess, I sat in my chair and felt not triumph exactly, but the particular sensation of a thing being level after years of being tilted. When they returned, Gerald informed the court that his client wished to revisit the question of settlement. Margaret looked at me. I gave a small nod. "Mrs. Harper remains open to settlement discussions," Margaret said. "However, given the forensic evidence now in the court record, our position on equitable distribution has been updated." She slid a document across to Gerald. He read it. Ron read it over his shoulder, and his face went through several things in quick succession that I watched carefully and felt I was owed. Cindy leaned forward and whispered. He shook his head. She whispered again, more urgently. He turned and looked at her with an expression I recognized from 40 years of marriage. The look of a man who feels his control of a situation slipping. And I understood that whatever was collapsing between them had probably been fragile for some time. "Are we proceeding or discussing?" the judge said, with the tone of a woman who had somewhere to be. "Discussing," Gerald said. 1 hour, the judge said. The settlement negotiation happened in a small conference room down the hall. A round table. A whiteboard covered in numbers from someone else's dispute. I sat beside Margaret. Ron sat across from me for the first time since this had begun. Not at my kitchen table, but in a neutral room where neither of us had history. He looked tired. Not performed exhaustion. Genuinely tired in the way of a person whose story has stopped working. Cindy was not in the room. Patricia, something had advised her to wait in the hallway. She sat on a bench outside with her arms folded, her expensive coat, and somewhere behind her, careful eyes, a recalculation, happening about the nature of her investment in Ronald James Harper. Gerald opened with a revised offer, 50% of the documented Meridian accounts, roughly $3,050,000, plus the house, plus revised spousal support. Margaret said that was closer, but we needed to discuss the third account, smaller, approximately $400,000, which David Park had identified in adjacent records and which Ron had not yet formally disclosed. Ron looked at Gerald with the expression of a man who has stepped on a nail he laid himself. After Gerald confirmed the forensic basis, there was a long pause. "All 3 accounts," Margaret said pleasantly, "plus the house, plus spousal support, and 1 provision." She placed a single sheet on the table. "Mrs. Harper will be held harmless from any tax liability related to the accounts in question. Any back taxes or penalties associated with the structuring of these accounts are Mr. Harper's sole responsibility." This was the detail with the most visible effect. The tax exposure on improperly structured accounts of this size was not a small figure. Ron's jaw tightened. They negotiated for 50 minutes. The final terms: the family home, free and clear. $3,400,000 from the combined accounts, transferred within 30 days. Spousal support of $6,500 per month for 12 years, reflecting my lost earning years, and the tax provision exactly as written. Ron would retain approximately $2,700,000 in remaining assets, minus Gerald Fitch's fees, minus taxes, minus penalties. Not nothing, but not the quiet, clean exit he had planned. Not the version of this story where Dorothy Harper accepted $800,000 and went away grateful. Ron signed the final settlement agreement on a Thursday afternoon in late February. Margaret called me afterward. "It's done," she said. I was sitting in my kitchen. The marigold beds were still bare outside the window. Too early yet for planting. But I had been thinking about what I would put in this spring. Something different. Something I had always wanted and never let myself choose. "Thank you," I told her. I had expected to feel something enormous. Relief, vindication, grief. What I felt was quieter. It felt like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. Evelyn came in from the garden and looked at my face. "Done?" she said. "Done," I said. She sat across from me and put her hand over mine, and we sat there without speaking. And it was enough. Cindy Marsh had quietly vanished from my narrative by then. Gerald had made clear during negotiations that any claim she might have imagined on the proceeds, any informal understanding, any promises made in Columbus on Thursday evenings, was neither legally enforceable nor something he was prepared to defend. Whatever they had built between them on the foundation of my clipped coupons and my missed flights and my years of apologizing for my own needs. That was theirs to sort out now. I had enough of my own life to attend to. Spring came early that year, and I planted something I had wanted for 15 years, a proper cutting garden. Dahlias, sweet peas, zinnias in 6 colors, cosmos that grew so tall by August they nodded over the fence into the sidewalk. The neighbors stopped to look at it. Paulette said it was the most beautiful front yard on the street, and I accepted the compliment without the strange, guilty deflection I had spent decades practicing. The house was mine now, fully, legally, in my name alone. I had the deed framed, not ostentatiously, just in a simple black frame, and hung it in the hallway where the family portrait used to be. Karen thought this was perhaps slightly aggressive. Beth thought it was perfect. I went to Savannah in April. Evelyn and I and 4 other women, all of us in our late 60s and 70s, all of us with our own histories of accommodation and endurance, rented a house on a cobblestone street for 10 days and ate shrimp and walked through squares filled with Spanish moss and stayed up too late talking about things we had wanted and hadn't allowed ourselves. It was the best trip I had taken in my life. I cried on the last day, but the good kind, the kind that comes from realizing you are happy, actually happy, in a way that is solid and earned. Karen's daughter, Lily, now 4, had become my particular joy. I flew to Columbus regularly. The flights were, it turned out, entirely affordable. And we went to the Children's Museum and made cookies and read books, and she fell asleep against my arm during movies with the total trust of a small person who knows she is safe. I missed no more birthdays. I missed no more of the ordinary days that turn out to be the ones you remember. I went back to something I had set aside decades ago. I started painting again. Watercolors, nothing remarkable, but mine. I took a class at the community center on Tuesday mornings, replacing, with some satisfaction, the time I had previously spent managing the perception of a marriage that was quietly failing me. The instructor said I had a good eye for light. I thought about that for days, and I joined, properly and with intention, the Thursday evening support group. no longer as someone in crisis, but as someone with 2 years of distance and a story that was useful to others. Gloria and I had become genuine friends. We took walks on Saturday mornings and talked about our gardens and our children and occasionally, briefly, our husbands, past and present and absent, with the equanimity of women who have come through something. Ron's life, from what I gathered through Karen and the practical unavoidability of information in a town like Millbrook, did not unfold the way he had planned. The tax penalties from the improperly structured Meridian accounts landed with the force of a delayed reckoning. David Park's forensic report had been thorough, and the IRS does not negotiate the way Gerald Fitch does. By the following summer, Ron was contesting a penalty assessment that his remaining assets could cover, barely. But the legal costs compounded. Gerald Fitch's firm was expensive, and Ron was now paying for it with money he had expected to be living on comfortably at 68. The Millbrook social ecology shifted around him in ways that a careful man who had spent years managing his reputation could not have fully anticipated. People talk. I had not spoken publicly about the details of the divorce. That was not my way. But some things are simply evident in the architecture of a settlement, in the terms of a court proceeding, in the forensic record that becomes public document. People in small towns read those things. They draw conclusions. He left Millbrook 18 months after the divorce was final. I heard he had gone to Columbus, closer to Cindy, closer to whatever they were reconstructing. I wished him no particular harm. I also felt no particular sorrow. Cindy Marsh, I learned eventually through Evelyn's network of reliable information, had not had the outcome she might have expected from the arrangement. The accounts she had co-signed, expecting, I imagine, to benefit from them one day, had been substantially consumed by the settlement and the tax proceedings. What remained belonged to Ron. The informal understanding, the Thursday evenings, the years of investment in that particular future, none of it had produced the return she'd planned for. The irony is not lost on me that both of them had, in different ways, done the same thing, built quietly toward a future they believed was secure, while failing to account for certain variables. I sat in my cutting garden on an August evening with Evelyn, the cosmos swaying at the fence, and the dahlias enormous and slightly absurd and wonderful. And I thought about the woman who had stood in her kitchen in her slippers, holding a check she wasn't supposed to find. She'd been frightened. She had been uncertain. She had been 70 years old with no financial independence and a plan that felt impossible. She had done it anyway. They say the best time to plant a garden is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. I spent 40 years trusting a man who trusted me not to look too closely. The moment I looked, everything changed. I was 70 years old with no plan and no financial history of my own. I found a lawyer. I found evidence. I found myself. If I can do it, so can you. What would you have done with that check? If this story moved you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, genuinely, for listening.